Okay, welcome everyone to today's webcast, Broken Borders, Responding to Trauma in Hispanic and Latino Immigrants and Refugees. The webcast today is designed to identify the impact of trauma on mental health and offer best practice approaches for responding to trauma in Hispanic and Latino, Latina, Latinx communities, in particular those who have immigrated or are seeking asylum in the US. I have named this a couple of times preparing for the event, but we are actively working to mute everyone's line to reduce background noise and are also stopping your video feeds. So if that happens on your end, that is what's supposed to happen. But please, if you have questions in the meantime related to anything technology related, or if something's popping up on your screen that you're unfamiliar with, please put that information in our chat box. We have a team of folks who are actively monitoring the line to be able to assist you with everything that you are experiencing on your end. I'm going to run through a series of sort of housekeeping things as we get underway. So definitely be listening for those things as well, and we will get going. So today's webcast is brought to you by the South-Southwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, an initiative funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration to provide free training and ongoing consultation to the diverse array of professionals that serve individuals with mental health challenges across our 5-state region, which includes Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arkansas, Louisiana, and several tribal communities. The Mental Health Technology Transfer Center is a project of the Texas Institute for Excellence in Mental Health, which is housed at the Steve Hicks School of Social Work at the University of Texas at Austin. We are proud to feature our own Dean Zayas on today's webcast, who, besides leading a world-renowned School of Social Work, is recognized nationally and internationally as a leading expert on trauma and mental health in Hispanic and Latino children and families. His decades of clinical and research in this area is frequently cited in the news and other media outlets, and he is regularly sought out to speak to professional and general audiences on this topic. In his presentation today, he will outline the trauma children and families experience when they immigrate or seek asylum in the US, and the adverse impact of that trauma on their future health and well-being. We appreciate him taking out time of his busy schedule to participate in today's event, along with Marisol Acosta and Gabriel Hurtado, two experienced practitioners based locally here in Austin, who serve Hispanic and Latino children and families directly impacted by our current immigration system. Through their work, both have advanced research and expanded best practice interventions in the field, and in today's presentations, we'll identify the approaches that you can use in your own workplace to promote the mental health and well-being in children, older adolescents, adults, and families in Hispanic and Latino communities who have experienced trauma while immigrating or seeking asylum in the US. We were thrilled to see the interest that this webcast generated, and we have already begun identifying ways to continue the conversation. So please keep your eyes peeled for more information about future events on this topic, and please do share with your coworkers and colleagues. Before I turn it over to Dean Zayas, who will kick things off for us today, I need to review a few housekeeping items with you. The first is to request that you complete the post-event evaluation of today's webcast. In order for us to continue to provide free events like this one, SAMHSA requires us to collect evaluation from participants and report the results. At the end of our webcast, I will display a link to the evaluations that you can use to complete the evaluation immediately. Please follow the instructions accordingly and email me at any time with questions. After the webcast, I will also send that link in a final email to participants. So for those of you who are not able to complete the evaluation immediately after the event, you'll have access to do that. And please know that we will actively be monitoring the results of those evaluations and adjust future events accordingly. So please let us know about your experience. For those of you in need of CEUs, the evaluation form functions as our post-test for today's event, which the university requires for webcast events, so you can receive your CEU certificate when you submit that evaluation. In the email that I send after the webcast, I'll include those details as well as other instructions for notifying me that you're in need of CEUs. Unfortunately, if you need to leave the webcast early today, we're not able to offer partial CEUs for the time you spent in the webcast. However, I'm excited to report that the webcast will be recorded and archived so that you may return to complete the portion of the webcast that you missed today. I'll also send a link to the recording in my wrap-up email that you can forward to coworkers and colleagues, and it will be posted on a site that allows us to continue to offer CEUs even through the recorded archive of today's webcast. I'm very excited about that. On that note, we recognize that some of you may be viewing today's events on coworkers' computers, and while we welcome as many participants as possible, we ask that everyone viewing today's event let us know that you are viewing it via email. And again, in my follow-up email, I'll include my email address so that you can send the email of any of your colleagues that are looking over your shoulder today for purposes of completing that evaluation. This will help us retain an accurate count of participants for reporting purposes and helps ensure that you have received all of the related information. Just a few more housekeeping points, all of the exciting information I know you're ready for. To limit background noise, as I've said, while presenters are speaking, we've automatically muted your Zoom connection lines. Please continue to use the chat box for any of your substantive questions. There will be dedicated question and answer period after each presenter, who will present for 45 to 50 minutes, and we'll reserve 10 minutes for that dedicated question and answer period. Again, we'll be monitoring the chat box, and I will read those questions to presenters during those question and answer periods. And last but not least, we recognize that this topic is sensitive and can elicit powerful and raw emotions. We'll have 2 short 5-minute breaks for you to step away from your computer after each presenter is finished. And use that time accordingly. We'll promptly reconvene so that we can stay on schedule. But please continue to check in with yourself during today's presentation and manage your self-care accordingly. And now, without further ado, I am honored to introduce Dr. Luis Zayas, Dean of the Steve Hicks School of Social Work and the Robert Lee Sutherland Chair in Mental Health and Social Policy. He also holds an appointment as Professor of Psychiatry at the Dell Medical School at UT. A native of Puerto Rico, Dean Zayas has lectured to university audiences around the world, including Chile, Dominican Republic, Honduras, Mexico, Mongolia, Nicaragua, Puerto Rico, and across the US. He is the author of numerous publications and books detailing his decades of clinical and research experience with Hispanic and Latino families and children. His most recent, Forgotten Citizens, Deportation, Children, and the Making of American Exiles and Orphans, focuses on the plight of US-born children of unauthorized immigrants who live under the constant threat of deportation or who have been deported. Forgotten Citizens received the 2016 Book Award honorable mention by the Society of Social Work and Research and was runner-up for the 2016 Hamilton Book Award. The School of Social Work has flourished under his leadership, and as I said earlier, I'm incredibly honored that he is joining us today to present on his research and findings from interviews he's conducted with children and families attempting to immigrate or seek asylum in the US through the US-Mexico border. With that, Dean, I'll turn over the proverbial mic to you.
Thank you very much, Alicia.
Perfect, and I will start the slideshow. Okay.
Good morning, everyone, and pardon the hiccup here as we get this technology going for us. It's an honor to be here among you today to tell you something about the experiences, the psychological experiences that children who are seeking, go back to the, thank you, the children who are here have migrated to the United States, mostly from Central America, the experiences that they're suffering, and my 2 colleagues will provide more information on how you go about helping those children. Next slide, please. What I'd like to do is cover the experiences of the children who are now often in detention, but at least have come through the border and are now trying to find destination cities here in the United States to join up with their families. The three traumas that I'll talk about are essentially what happens in their countries of origin, what happens on the way to the United States, and what happens once they are in the United States. Next slide. We've all seen what has been reported in Central America, the pre-migration trauma of many of the children who are now held in detention centers and processed and then released, sometimes to the United States, sometimes deported home. There's been a lot of violence, been going on for a long time. The gangs in Central America, the police complicity, the government inaction, the poverty, of course, all together affect the three Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And it's those three countries that are leading to most of the children who are appearing at our borders alone, unaccompanied, or with their parents. And in this slide, you see some of the images of the things that the children are facing. I'd like to focus on one child that I met. Next slide, please. In one of the detention centers. This is a drawing from a 6-year-old boy. He was 7 at the time, but that I met him. But he's describing what happened in his small town in Honduras. There you'll see a horrified son looking over a, it's a little washed out, but it's his village. Actually, it's at the side of a hill where his uncle, his grandparents, and his parents had homes. And the Rebos Locos, as they're called, are some of the gang members who smoke cigarettes, as he told me, and have firearms, and they're shooting at birds and shooting at people, setting things on fire. And this is the condition that this boy was living and experiencing. In the next picture, in the next drawing, he now elaborates a story. The story here is of another horrified son overlooking a tragedy. Over on the left, you'll see a body with some red, from the red crayon that Danny used. That's his uncle. His uncle was killed by 2 or 3 rebels locals who entered his home and shot his uncle. Danny ran over to his uncle's house when he heard about the shooting and described to me how horrified he was to see his uncle's face disfigured by the guns and seeing his uncle's teeth protruding at the back of his head. In the corner of that picture, you see his mother, mi mamá, mi papá. He had a brother as well. Has a brother as well. And you'll see that the stick figure of the father has one leg and a crutch. He's an amputee. After his uncle was killed, the gangs threatened his family, so they had to flee. However, his father could not flee with them. Danny told me about how hard it was and how difficult it was to say goodbye to his father and leave for the United States with his mother and his brother. It was the sort of loss that no child should have experienced, and certainly to be able to have seen his uncle's death was something that few children should ever see, no children should ever see. And there, Danny gave me a sense of the sort of pre-migration violence that goes on nearly every day in Central America, which is driving those tens of thousands of families to take the risks of coming through Mexico to the United States. In a sense, they'd rather be dead trying to get out than dead in their hometowns with all that kind of violence. I heard of 15-year-old girls who were attacked by the gang members, raped, assaulted in all sorts of ways, and invited to be members of the gang so that they could be essentially the girlfriends, the gang members. Teenage boys had no choice but to join. If they didn't join, it meant death. Many of the families that I met, and I have met in the past 5 years, all told the same story, and for that reason, many of them fled. Next slide, please. While they leave their countries, they transit through to Mexico. One of the things I commonly hear from them is, on the way, they did not know who they could trust. They were being led by coyotes, these human smugglers. They were accosted by criminals and organized gangs. There was violence, intimidation, physical abuse, sexual assault. There were imprisonments and deprivation. Mothers told me about sometimes being held for up to periods of 2 weeks in empty houses, warehouses, with no running water, no toilets, no food, until the coyotes had enough people to bring together across the border. And so until that group grew, they could not move forward. And it was all of that depravity and deprivation. There was all the constant sense of danger. Mothers would tell me about the violence that they encountered. One mother told me of how a busload of women and children, the women were unloaded, about 14 women. All of the women were raped, and 2 were held by the men. The other 12 were returned to the bus. This mother didn't tell me she was raped, but in that omission, she confirmed it. She also told me that her 13-year-old daughter had been thrown off a truck, and as the coyotes and criminals fled from the police, and the girl broke her foot, her ankle. It was by the grace of 3 other men, migrants who helped that young girl with her leg by rubbing it and creating a splint that allowed her to get to the US border, never with any anesthesia, but they managed. And that's the sort of experiences that people have. So we've talked about the pre-migration trauma, the trauma that these children experience in the transit, the things that they've seen, the dead bodies, violence, and other extortions that go on. So they're already experiencing 2 levels of trauma as they get to our borders. Next, please. When they arrive at the U.S. border, they ask for asylum, and typically, if they cross through through a bridge or some kind of a crossing, they might be taken by Immigration and Customs enforcement, and if not, they will be taken into Customs and Border Protection. From there, they have to ask for asylum, of course, and they're taken to these hieleras. Hieleras are these large rooms that house 30 people for about 72 hours. It's incredibly cold. The air conditioning is kept intentionally in the 50s. Lights are on all day, and all 30 or so people, as shown in this picture, share one toilet. That's the toilet behind the half wall in the back. It is really an inhuman experience. It's no way to treat asylum seekers as they come in. We're now talking about people who have experienced an awful lot of trauma in their histories, and then in the transit through Mexico. And now our government treats them this way. Again, they're kept in these hieleras for 72 hours or so before they're transported to a detention center. I might add that sometimes they're kept in perreras or kennels, which are equally as daunting as the one being kept in hieleras. And it's a consistent narrative that I hear from families of the hieleras, and it's something that's entering our common vocabulary now. Next slide, please. What happens when these children are in detention? We do know that there are 2 determinants of what creates the trauma of being in detention. One is the deprivation that children experience. There's the absence of expected, developmentally appropriate environmental inputs and complexity. Children don't ride bikes. They don't go to a community school. They don't have day trips, field trips to a petting zoo. They don't have the experiences that most children will have in an average community of living life as normally as possible. Going to churches, playing soccer, going to ballet classes, attending after-school events, going to church events during the week. All of that is gone. There are no children except other children who are in the same boat in this detention. That's the first level of deprivation that these children that is caused by detention, and is one of the most toxic elements of the detention. The other is the threat. That's the presence of immediate and ongoing experience of the threat to the child's sense of security, physical integrity, and psychological security. Guards are not nice people, and most of these detention centers are governed by private prison corporations that are paid per day, per person, per bed by the U.S. government, and they try to make a buck. So they're not inclined to be very generous about the supports that they give children. Guards will say things like, "You may be returned to your country. They're going to deport you. You're not going to, or you're going to be here for a long time. You may never get out of this place." And you can imagine hearing that on a daily basis. This is what detention has. It upsets children's ordinary routines, families' routines, the rituals that family have of telling their children nighttime stories, of being able to say prayers at night. Families are held in cells with other families, with people always milling about, and mothers cannot prepare a meal for a child. It's all done in institutional environments, and families do not live together. Unfortunately, the state of Texas has allowed some of these detention facilities to be licensed as licensed child care facilities. There's now certifiable licensed child care facilities, and waive many of the restrictions that govern any type of child care facility, such as how many children can live in a room, that children may not sleep with unrelated adults. All of these things are gone, and these detention centers can operate as child care facilities. Next slide, please. We have seen both the work that I've done, but the work of others, that there's an awful lot of depression among these children. They experience self-harm. They will cut themselves. We've had teenagers, especially, who have talked about suicide, taking their own lives because they cannot bear with the idle life in detention, with the uncertainty of where they're going to go next, what they're going to do, what life is going to be like. They aspire to education and detention. They don't know what's going to happen with their lives. And we see many levels of emotional disturbances and developmental regressions. Children who have an 8-year-old boy who regressed to bedwetting after, of course, being dry from childhood. An 11-year-old girl resorting to breastfeeding again from her mother out of the sort of trauma that she was experiencing. The social withdrawal of many of the children and the isolation. They tell me about the boredom and the extreme sadness, but that sense of hopelessness that is part of being in detention. We have the night terrors, the nightmares. We have the somatic complaints of children, of aches and pains that children would not otherwise be experiencing. But that's part of this dehumanization of the detention centers, which are intended to deter people from following from Central America. We know that policy has not really worked. Next slide, please. The most recent, perhaps the most difficult of all of these things was the separation of children from their families last summer. We recall that children were separated from their parents no matter how old they are. Even today, in the recent reports, not all of those children have been reunited, or that the reunifications have not gone well. We know that when you separate a child from the parent, the most important human connection in development, we know that is going to affect the child's connection to that parent upon reunification. Children sense the parental tension. When mothers are held in detention, they know the children sense it, even if the mother tries to portray things as going well, things are okay. But the mothers are anxious, the mothers are depressed, and children sense that. I have seen how attentive children are to their parents, and consequently come closer in attachment and tend to cling, in part to protect their mothers. We do know that when you disrupt the attachment of children, that we will see adverse events during sensitive developmental periods, which shape the brain development of children. And when we have this separation, which is what we had last summer, we disrupt the socio-emotional development, the cognition, the language, and the health of children. So let's just take a moment here and look back. So we're talking about children who have had this awful experience in their home countries. They're fleeing because their parents are being extorted. There's constant violence. There's government inaction. There's police complicity. And then they trek off to an uncertain future. They don't know who to trust as they come in. Is that street vendor over there trustworthy? Can we buy our food from that person? Is that nice, kindly looking lady sitting by the church, can we trust her to give us directions as to where we need to go or where we can find shelter? It's a given that they can't trust police. Who is the good person? Who is not the good person? Who can they trust? And so they are already adding to this ongoing stress. And we do know that these continuous, prolonged, intense adversity does accumulate and have its impact. And so when they get to the United States, they are held in these detention centers under these conditions of deprivation and threat. They're not provided freedoms. They're not provided the care. We just saw last month the 300 or so children who were being held in the detention center, who hadn't bathed or changed clothes in 2 weeks, who were hungry. There was flu outbreaks, and it was something that no country, certainly not the U.S., should allow to see. So we're talking about all of these events, and then there are the occasions in which we have separated children from their parents. Next slide, please. So let's talk a moment about what happens when we disrupt a child's attachment. In the attachment literature and research, we know that when there's that, after the separation and there's the reunification experience, we might see a secure child, formerly securely attached child, no longer feeling so securely attached. One of the ways that they might show it is through an insecure avoidant attachment, a reactive attachment disorder, in which they reject the caregiver, or rather they expect the rejection of the caregiver, and so they avoid that person. And in this video that was shown throughout the world, we see a young boy named Sammy, who was reunited with his mother at Houston Airport. Go ahead and play it. Can you hear that? Let's take a moment. Let's take a moment and pause. In that video, you saw this child who had been separated from his parents, from his mother for about 3 months, and from his father for about 2 months. They were separated at the border, and the boy and his father were taking one direction. He was then those two were separated. They were then brought together, the father and the son, and they reunited with the mother at the airport. This is the first time that the father has seen his little girl, and he's clutching onto her for dear life. What you see in Sammy is that he is avoiding his mother. He doesn't know if he can trust her any longer. His attachment has been disrupted. At one moment, you see him crawling toward his father, and one perhaps thinks that he's going to be there to have a secure anchor, that being his father. But instead, he continues past his father, between his legs, to the door. He doesn't know what to do. He cannot trust that the caregiver, his mother, who was so important to him, is perceived as having abandoned him. He cannot make that attachment a secure attachment, which he once would have had, presumably. And in this video, we see how insecure he is and how he avoids her and even avoids his father. Although, as I say, in one moment, you think that he's about to approach the father, but he's really trying to run away from them. It's interesting that this case was later featured on 60 Minutes, and the family was now reunited. The boy was doing a little bit better, but the mother in that story was also describing how it's still difficult for the boy, and that they're working through that connection again. We hope that's being done with an experienced clinician. Next slide, please. Now, another possible reaction to that separation, that traumatic separation, is that the child returns in the moment of reunification. It's an insecure but ambivalent relationship with the parent. In the insecure ambivalent, the child is uncertain of the caregiver's affection. Unlike the other boy who wasn't angry but just evasive, avoidant of his parent, in this case, the child really is angry and resistant. He doesn't want his parents. He's uncertain of the love and the care that the caregiver can give, and so reacts with anger and resistant behavior. In this next clip, we see a boy and his mother interacting at a time when they have been now reunited. He's a slightly older boy, but listen to him. And there you hear a voice saying, "You're not my mother. I would rather return to jail than to be with you." He doesn't understand that it was not his mother who abandoned him. It was a rupture in their attachment caused by a government policy that said zero tolerance, and families could be separated. Now, I've shown you just two images, but imagine the number of families that have gone through this same experience. That separation, the detention, the trauma that they have experienced for so long. How do we manage those? What can we expect of these children when that is happening? They don't understand. They're too young to understand what a government policy means. They only understand that for that moment they were detained, they're treated as criminals, and then now they are separated from their parents forcibly and returned. So these are just two, but remember too that we saw images of children behind fences with barbed wires in prisons. We saw them housed in kennels, perreras. We have seen them affected by so many kinds of conditions that really are adverse to their lives. And so I want to go on to the next slide, please, and begin to summarize what the effects are on children. You're watching this webcast because you're interested in children's mental health and how we serve them. But let's think about what happens what trauma does. And we know something about adverse childhood experiences, the accumulation of stress and trauma on children that is unremitting and untreated. And we do know that it really affects the children's developmental trajectories. One of the things that it does, as I mentioned earlier, is dysregulation of the children's stress responses. When their hormones are secreting under these awful conditions, it goes on and on. There's no respite from it. And so we have the effects of the body beginning to break down. We begin to see symptoms and behaviors, and biological measurements all show us what happens under this prolonged, intense stress period. These children internalize negative attributions. I am bad. I must have done something wrong to deserve this. I will never be a good person. I will never be considered a good person. There's a diminished hope and expectation for their future. As I mentioned, teenagers lost hope about would they ever be able to get an education? Would they ever be able to continue their lives as they had anticipated, to go to high school and go on to college and have a career and have a family, take care of their mothers and their families. We do know that when the young brain is in its developmental stages is assaulted this way, there's difficulty with self-regulation, but especially self-esteem regulation, part of that internalized negative attribution. And we do see the functional impairments that occur in key psychological, social, and academic pursuits that the children have. They're not apt to do as well. Things like judgment is impaired, and reasoning and making the right choices. Next slide, please. We know that there are long-term effects of migration and this kind of aggressive immigration enforcement. One of the things that our research has shown is the hypervigilance that children live with, both within detention and even after they've been released. By the way, we've also seen this among children of undocumented immigrants who are living in the United States and are even US citizen children, but whose parents are still undocumented and subject to deportation. They're constantly checking over their shoulders, the constant dread of the arrest and the detention and the possible deportation of their parents. The children who have come into this country through the border more recently seeking asylum fear the same things. Sure, they have notices to appear at immigration court in order to be determined whether they can stay as asylum as asylees or not. But there's that constant dread. It could happen any day. When we hear the government say that this weekend, this Sunday, this Monday, we are going to conduct raids throughout this country. That is an act of terrorism. It sets terror in the hearts of these children and families. And I think those of us who work with this community are also equally terrorized by these statements. And so again, there's that vigilance, the hypervigilance and fear of what will happen. Will it happen to us this time? We do know that families, even those who have U.S. citizen children or who have green cards, have fewer healthcare visits. They avoid using childcare, though they may be eligible for it. They don't secure food stamps because of the fear of being of being exposed and being caught. They have economic hardships. There's a lot of housing instability, which means that they don't have necessarily secure homes in which they can stay. This goes both for the children of undocumented immigrants who have been living here for decades or more, as well as for the children who are who have gone through the detention experience and have come in through ICE or Customs and Border Patrol. Again, as I mentioned earlier, parental anxiety is transmitted to the children, even though parents may not voice it. It really affects the children's development, but importantly, it disrupts their sense of belonging. Where do I belong? I'm not treated like I belong in this country, but I don't want to live in my country. I don't belong in that other country because it's too dangerous. We have these children who are stateless in many ways. And remember that how important it is to be part of a country. It's part of our identity. It's part of our sense of security. It's part of our future. And that's disrupted sense of belonging is something that children of undocumented immigrants and those who have arrived on our borders recently are facing. Next slide, please. Again, we know that there are long-term effects. We do know from the research on adverse childhood experiences that among the difficulties or the challenges that these children will face are not just those things that I've mentioned, the psychological effects, the cognitive, intellectual, the social effects, but also the likelihood of developing chronic illnesses, diabetes, hypertension, asthma, and so on. Chronic illnesses that are known to be connected to the experiences of adversity during childhood that are prolonged and intense and layered, as I mentioned earlier, from the pre to the in transit to the post detention experiences. As I mentioned, children feel criminalized, helpless. They may function as if they continue to be detained or will be detained again. And there's this shattered sense of safety and well-being. As I mentioned, nightmares and night terrors and the humiliation that they experience in detention. So we've got our work cut out for us. As clinicians, we now know and are learning more about the effects of these traumas on children, of what happens to them when they are detained with their parents, what happens now after those that have been separated from their parents. We've got to think carefully as clinicians, how do we deal with them? I do think that there are ways that our government could handle the immigration process to process these families in a much more humane way. But until that happens, we at the community have to now grapple with how do we work with these families and children? How do we screen them? How do we triage those who need the most attention, the immediate attention? This will be going on for a long time, and we're all going to need to pay attention to it. Next slide, please. With that, I'll leave it to my colleagues who are experienced clinicians to tell you more about what we can do in the future. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you, Dean. I'd like to open it now to questions. We, again, are using our chat box to submit questions for the Dean related to everything he has discussed this morning. And Dean, again, thank you so much. I very much value the information you've shared today, and think it's so important for everybody to hear and pay witness to. So please feel free to send your questions, like I said, through the chat box. You can open up your chat box on the top of your Zoom screen under your settings.
There are some interesting comments coming in about reactive attachment disorders. We also see comments about the parent-child dynamics because the parents are in jail and the children are not.
Looks like we have a couple of questions coming through. Let's start with, upon reunification, are there services and resources available to assist the families with some of the traumatic events?
Well, it really depends on where they are arriving at, what their destination cities are. We do know that there are no services while they're in detention. There's supposed to be medical care and mental health care in detention centers, but they're not very good. I have visited them, I've spoken to the providers, and really it's not much available there. And then it depends on where they arrive and what city they arrive. There are no planned or programmed services for reunification to help these families go through and work through the traumatic experiences. And it depends on where they land. So it will depend on the municipality. But we do know that we have enough information about trauma-informed care. So our best bet as clinicians is to direct families to trauma-informed care, trauma-informed child therapy, family therapy, because that's really critical. And I think it's important also to note that even the measures that I've tried to use in my research for trauma simply don't capture the magnitude, the enormity of the kind of trauma these children experience. When many of our trauma symptom checklists are used, they capture things that are typical and kind of more typical to American life. Have you seen an automobile accident? Have you heard shootings? Have you heard shots in your neighborhood? Have you seen a dead body? But those fall short to the kind of adversity that kids in a place, like Honduras, El Salvador, or Guatemala experience, where this is ongoing violence, where they see bodies hanging from overpasses as ways for gangs to threaten the community, or just the level of violence that goes on and how pervasive it is and how it strikes at the heart of everyone. Many of our checklists don't capture that sort of trauma. So we've got to be attuned to understanding that it's more than just immediate traumatic events, but rather a pervasive situation.
Thank you, Dean. And I think that also answers one of the immediate following questions: what is currently being done with these children to reestablish a sense of safety? And also, for those of you who joined after the Dean got started, our two next presenters will identify the interventions and strategies available for children, adolescents, and their families. Certainly, Dean, if any of these questions feel like there are things that you want to add to, by all means, please do.
Sure.
Please go ahead.
Okay, I see some of the questions. How long will it take? Can it take a child to recover from this trauma in general? I don't think the kind of trauma we're talking about, if it goes untreated, it will never be really resolved. It does require intervention or an exceptionally unusual family that can help a child through. But remember that it's not just the children who have experienced the trauma, but their parents have as well. So it will take years of therapy to undo this trauma. That we know. Just if we look at historically what happened to people when they were kept in detention centers and saw this kind of the violence that we're talking about, whether it happened in Africa, in the internment camps of World War II, or in the concentration camps of Nazi Germany. We do know that trauma doesn't go away. It lasts for lifetime and crosses generations. There was another question here. What is currently being done with these children to reestablish a sense of safety? Honestly, I don't know. There's no systematic way of finding out what's going on in the places that they arrive to. What are those agencies doing? that is something we don't know. Certainly the government is not providing funding to be able to capture all of the different experiences, the programs that are being used to help children establish that safety. But my colleagues later will tell you more about the different interventions. One other question that came up here, has there been any additional trends found in consideration to an older population when it comes to residual effects of family separation? Are there different effects in older populations found after reunification? The answer to that is we don't know. Because it's happened so recently, researchers, we're trying to gear up. Even now, we are trying to study, we have a grant to study the children who have been released from detention center. Finding them, capturing them, being able to interview them is difficult. It's hard to get to them. So it will take years, unfortunately, before we can answer some of these questions. One other question that I want to address is, how were you able to gather this information? Were you given access to detention facilities? Early on, I was among a group of advocates who was able to tour the insides of Orange City Detention Center, Family Residential Detention Center, and I saw the insides of their cells where they had multiple families. We saw the commissary. We saw the dining area. We met with guards. I subsequently visited other facilities, again, as part of advocacy groups. So I've seen the inside. But even beyond seeing the inside, you would listen to what the families are telling you. They describe things of what's happening inside that are very believable. In one case, I had a mother who had gone on a hunger strike. She was then placed in what they called was medical separation, but it was really what you and I would call isolation. Her son was placed in there with her for 24 hours. I later interviewed them separately and asked them to draw the floor plan of the room that they were in, and they were identical. So I got confirmation from them that the experience, what the experience was like, with cameras on, focused on them, the lights on 24 hours, the cold room, and the fact that nobody came to see them except slipped food through the door for them to eat during that 24 hours. So those are the sorts of experiences that families will tell you that make it very believable.
And Dean, there's a question specifically about the court experience. What is being done to help the Latino community when they are sent to immigration courts?
Well, one of the great blessings in the United States are the pro bono attorneys who are representing these families. I can't, if we have to anoint some heroes, it is those folks who are there every day filing the court document to try to help families represent them. Some attorneys are able to reach out to some of us who are social workers, psychologists, other mental health providers, to be able to evaluate children and to give affidavits or declarations that can be included in the court testimony to demonstrate the harm that the children have suffered, what will happen if they're continued to be kept in detention, why they need asylum, why they should be granted asylum. Those are the things that are happening, but it also depends nationally what immigration court you land at as to what your chances are of being granted asylum or even legal permanent resident status, or even a cancellation of removal if you are if you have been in the U.S. a while. In places like Georgia, the courts are really very difficult and tough and grant very few waivers, whereas other courts around the country are much more generous. So it depends. But again, we have to thank the advocates, the legal advocates, who are filing the papers to get the asylum claims for many of these families.
Wonderful. And then we have a question regarding therapeutic approaches. Which approach is most recommended to treat these children? We realize it should be trauma-informed, but is there a better approach? I know our next two speakers, especially Gabriela Hurtado, will be able to speak more to this. I don't know if there's anything you want to cover briefly here, and then we can move on to some other questions.
No, I've covered a lot already.
Yes, perfect. Okay. Next up, what barriers do mental health providers face with attempting to offer services in these facilities? For example, do facilities put parameters in place limiting our availability to get in to offer services? What do you see as the biggest challenge with getting qualified, experienced trauma providers connected with families and children?
If the question is addressing what happens within the detention centers, basically none of us can go in there and do anything.
Mm-hmm.
Only the mental health providers who are hired by either the private prison companies and are employees of theirs, or if, as it happens in some places, they are government employees. We cannot go in there and give treatment. When I've gone in to support an asylum claim, I'm there because I'm working with an attorney, and I'm allowed to do an evaluation. That's it. I'm not there to provide therapy. And after all, I wouldn't want to because I can't continue. I'd be there once and then leave, and it's not for therapy purposes. So we really can't do anything within the detention centers, though it would be great if we could. It's once the families are released into the communities where we can, in our agencies, provide the care that they really need.
The next question seems to be possibly a more policy-related question, but I want to ask it just in case you've got any information or statistics. How often do Latino U.S. citizens get deported?
Well, U.S. citizens don't get deported. What happens is that someone in their family gets deported. So by definition, the law says that once you have, a U.S. citizen may not be deported. They can be imprisoned, they can have charges filed against them, all sorts of things, but they cannot be deported. The people who are deported are those who are in the country illegally or have overstayed their visa and have not returned to their country. Those are the folks that are, but they're not citizens. Even even legal permanent residents may be deported if they commit a crime. So a U.S. citizen may not be deported. What has happened, and this is what I chronicle in the book, Lost, Forgotten Citizens, is that it's the children, the U.S.-born citizen children of undocumented immigrant parents who are deported. Those children are affected by deportation, and their parents may take them with them to the other countries. So they're really exiles, not deportees. And that's the distinction I make in the book about what happens to these children. So they're not deported, but they might follow their parents to another country. We found that especially among younger children, parents are less likely to leave younger children behind. They might leave the teenager in the care of someone, a friend, a family member, after they're deported, if the child is a U.S. citizen.
Next question is related to the rights of children. Is there anything that we can do, I'm assuming we, meaning providers and other practitioners, can do to enforce the children's rights?
Advocacy. We have to raise our voice, and everywhere we can, join social movements, join advocacy groups, donate to them, write your op-eds, your letters to the editor, write to your congresspeople, your representatives, anyone you can to help children's rights. Even at the state level, when the state of Texas was considering qualifying the detention centers to be licensed child care facilities, we were at the state house testifying against it. We were also in the court when it was being heard in the district court. Those are the ways that we can act to ensure that children's rights are protected, and that by all means that our laws follow the best interest of the child standard.
And back to therapeutic interventions, we have a question here. First, a comment. We can also provide psychoeducation on symptoms of reactive attachment disorder or trauma to parents, like a family session upon reunification. Question in there being, have you ever heard of narcissistic victim syndrome? And I've not heard of that. Maybe my clinician colleagues who will be speaking shortly can address that, but I'm not familiar with that. Perfect. And the last question I'm seeing on here, it seems to be related to probably a specific family that someone is working with. So I'll read this out for you and see where you might be able to provide some insight. If not, we can get some more information out later. If an immigrant parent who has a visa, a U visa, and whose child is an American citizen was not able to make her court date and was given deportation papers, is there anything she can do? Is there anything, also the child's stepdad may be an American citizen, but mom doesn't want him to keep the child. The child doesn't know his biological dad, who is a citizen. She wanted to know if the child will be left with the state or with one of his fathers. Mom doesn't want the child to go back to her country.
That's going to be a tough one, and it will really depend on what the court says. And it sounds to me like even if the mom doesn't want the child to go to the father, the court might default in that direction. They would have to prove that the father's unfit to be a parent, that there's all sorts of, problems with him, his moral turpitude, or his lifestyle, or criminal background, or whatever, that might have the courts deny him his rights. Otherwise, it probably will default to him. I'm not an attorney, so I can't really say, but in my experience with over the years with families, it's likely that it would go to the parents unless there's a suitable alternate family member that can prove that he or she can take care of the child. But in this case, I think the father will likely get custody.
And for the person who asked that question, you sent that to me privately, so I'm not wanting to name your name here, but if there are specific follow-up questions regarding that case, please let me know and I can try to connect you with the right person who can get you that information. I think we have time for one more question, and one came in that I think is probably good for our last question. I remember doing art therapy, play therapy approaches. Why are some sites not allowing it and saying it is for recreational therapy?
I'm going to have to defer to my clinician colleagues to answer that one. I really can't say enough. But it is one of the means. Art therapy is excellent, and play therapy, certainly to have the child really put into kind of visual form the kind of traumatic experiences and their internal psychological states.
Perfect. I think we'll wrap up the question and answer period here. There were a couple last ones that came through, but we will try to get those answered for you via email or chat box itself. I would like to take right now our first 5-minute break, but before I do, thank you again, Dean Zayas, for all of your helpful recounting of your research and sharing the experiences of families that you have worked with. Dean Zayas is, correct me if I'm wrong, planning to stay on for the duration of the webcast, and at the very end of the event, we'll have more open question and answer for all 3 presenters. And again, if there are other questions that come up for you as you're thinking about his presentation, please do send that in the chat box, and you can also send me a private email message. So let's take 5 minutes. We will reconvene at, let's say, 12:06 now. And at that time, we will have Marisol Acosta, who is currently the Director of Clinical Services at Any Baby Can, a nonprofit organization that guides parents and children to reach their full potential, located here in Austin. She's done extensive work with children and families, and I think she'll be a rich source of information, specifically on some of these questions that you have asked here. So again, 5 minutes, and we will reconvene about 12:06. Thanks, everyone. Fantastic. Well, I am so pleased to present Marisol Acosta. As I said, she is currently the Director of Clinical Services at Any Baby Can, a local nonprofit organization here in Austin that guides parents and children to reach their full potential. She's also formerly the project director of Texas Children Recovering from Trauma, an initiative at the Department of State Health Services. She's also done an extensive amount of work with the Health and Human Services Commission in her immediate previous position, which I know so much of what she'll be discussing today draws on her experiences from both positions. Marisol is an experienced practitioner with decades of experience serving refugee and asylum-seeking families and children. She's a graduate certificate in refugee trauma from Harvard University and has been affiliated with national organizations, including SAMHSA's National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and the Complex Trauma Treatment Network. Marisol continues to work with families who have immigrated to the US and trains clinicians and case managers in culturally adaptive and trauma-informed approaches in care. And Marisol, I know that there is a lot about your experience that I may have left off here, so please fill in where I have left the gaps, and I will turn it over to you, and so appreciate you being a part of today's event.
Well, thank you for having me today. I am thrilled and excited about this so much needed training and webcast to the folks who are listening. So I have been in multiple roles working with unaccompanied minors, refugees, and asylum seekers. I've been a volunteer Physicians for Human Rights as a psychological evaluator since 2008. And have done a lot of work when I was at the state as the director of that initiative that she mentioned. I was also the children mental health director for the state of Texas in the last 2 years, in the midst of this crisis when a lot of changes happening in the state regarding policies that allowed to serve these children that were taken out from funding and availability of services and programs. So I'm gonna I'm also a member of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and the co-founder of Experto Solutions, which is an organization that focuses on elevating the quality of care through best practices and increasing competency. And we are very much in promoting trauma-informed care. And in working with this population, that is a framework that I will mention briefly during the presentation. Now, even though I have a lot of experience working with children, I also have experience working with adults. And in my role today, I'm gonna be introducing best practices in serving adults who are asylum seekers and refugees. And in this presentation, my intention is to increase your knowledge of some of the best practices and foundations of providing mental health services to this population. And I will also help you apply the engagement concept of meeting the clients where they are to the actual practical understanding of that in the context of the client's migration phase. Now, Dr. Dean Sayas gave like a great presentation, and he mentioned some of these migration phases. I will go a little bit more in detail about them because depending on where your clients that you have is the actual selection that you would do in terms of selection of best practices. And so before taking any clinical action, I just want to Dean did a great job about stopping and making us think about the impact and the conditions in which unaccompanied children are being detained. Now, this is also happening to adults, to their parents. And so the inhumane conditions are across the board in multiple detention facilities. So the impact of the changes in policies and services, and also the large amount of populations that are arriving through our borders also have impacted, the conditions in which they are served now. That doesn't justify that people are actually suffering from any need of the most basic needs of hygiene, safety, food, health, and of course financial stability that they lose. And so I want you to stop that. In addition to understanding where they are from the impact of trauma, that you also need to think that when working, and I'm going to move us a little bit to think about working with adults, if that is the impact of children in fully developed adults, then they're going to be more conscious about the impact of what is happening to them. For the most part, some of them will be able to actually express and be vocal about their needs, while others, because they may actually come with a lot of history of complex trauma, a lot of multiple layers of exposure to trauma, then you may see different behaviors and responses from adults when you engage with them. But we have to also think that the role that we have when we're actually being the mental health profession that is being called to intervene, or called to observe, or called to screen, or called to do a psychological evaluation, that whether we like it or not, our position is a position of power, is a position of expertise, is a position of authority that is given by the nature of our work. And we are working with a population, whether it's refugees or asylum seekers, who, because of their experiences, will actually have a lot of distrust to people in authority. So building that trust is something that you have to think about. And how do you engage your clients way from the beginning? How do you connect with them? How do you do not make assumptions in terms of what the things that we define that are like trauma, the things that we may define as what is mental health, the things that we define in the United States of what violence is, what screening is, what treatment is our actual cultural notions about this concepts, and that the people that we work with may not actually know or understand what is the purpose of our services, why are we there, why are we asking all these questions, if they're surrounded by people that they cannot necessarily trust at this point. And so that is a place to start before we take any clinical action, to really focus on the trust, and mostly to actually first focus and do no harm, in using that ethical foundational principle to actually guide our care, as we may be for them, their first mental health provider that they may ever see, the first advocate that they may see, the first healer that they may actually face, or you may be actually the first listener or the first witness to their story. And so we have to be very cautious as we do our role in doing interventions, assessment, or treatment, in how do we engage, how do we observe, how do we screen, how do we assess, ensuring that we will not harm them, that we will not re-traumatize them. And by doing so, we have to be culturally sound, and beyond cultural competence. This is, in working with this population, it's important, the concept of cultural humility, that we actually are humble, that we are in an open attitude to learn from our clients and give them the role of experts, and then share that power that we have, and make an assumption that we actually do not know anything about their culture, that even if we speak the same language as they do. And this has happened to me multiple times in doing psychological evaluations for asylum seekers. And I'm originally from Puerto Rico, and so my Spanish is Puerto Rican Spanish. And even though I have been living in Texas for 20 years, when I'm meeting people from Central America and from other countries that actually speak Spanish, there may be a lot of concepts about their culture, about their thoughts, about their values, about the way that I express myself in Spanish, that may not connect with them, that may not have any meaning with them, or that actually could be harmful, or could be something that could be even considered inappropriate. So always you have to be a constant mind of openness, a constant mind of clarifying, of being inquisitive in a humble way, no, in an authoritarian way, when you're asking and engaging these individuals. And so in addition to also have these linguistic appropriate services and culturally sound services, that we involve interpreters as much as we need for the translation of our services, but also to ensure that the documents that we provide for them to sign, for them to complete, that the instruments that we pick are also validated and linguistically appropriate for the population that we're working with. And so in doing so, and moving forward, how do we work with these adults, or these children, as a matter of fact? In this presentation, I'm doing sort of a transition from Dean's amazing presentation to make a connection of how do we understand our role, and then move to the implementation, the selection and implementation of best practices. So that role may have different forms, in which we can be an observer or an advocate, in which we can be a brief mental health supporter, or that we can be the psychological evaluator or the forensic psychological evaluator, however the legal counsel or the legal advocate defines us to be, or that we are the psychotherapist or a psychiatrist that actually providing treatment to these adults or these immigrants after the resettlement. And so the role of the observer is much to the person that actually maybe is called to be in the role as a mental health expert, to observe, maybe to influence immigration policy, or maybe influence the through your expertise the development of best practices, and to help increase through advocacy the awareness of the mental health needs and the awareness of what is happening to the immigrant population and refugees. Now, as a brief mental health supporter, your role may be that you're actually called briefly to do a quick intervention. Maybe there's a big group that came in, and then you're just called for one day. And I remember when I was at state, the Health and Human Services Commission, I faced that there was a call for volunteers because in 2 days, there was this opportunity of actually evaluating 2,000 unaccompanied minors in 2 days. And so we were doing this call for volunteers. And so some people went as volunteers to do those evaluations, but other people actually went to briefly support those newly arrived children and adults and families to provide some brief intervention, some brief support to help them in the adjustment of living in these facilities. And the psychological evaluator will be the person that is actually doing the formal evaluation that will be presented in court, that is presented in writing as an affidavit, and that provides testimony and evidence of the ill treatment, the persecution, the harm or torture that is part of the legal request to seek asylum for the individual. Now, we also need to actually stretch ourselves, and I am not an expert, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an expert in law, I'm not a lawyer, but part of doing a best practice in working with this population is that those who serve them do have
For everyone who is on and listening, I very much apologize. I wish I had more control over technology some days. Especially right now. Gabby, thank you for joining in, pinch hitter. We are going to move to Gabrielle Hurtado's presentation. I very much appreciate Gabriela for being on and available to engage in this webcast today. She's an incredibly connected practitioner who's done quite a bit of work actually with Dean Zayas in his research at the border. Gabriela is a licensed psychologist and co-owner of a private practice here in Austin called Prickly Pear Therapy and Training. Her clinical interests involve the treatment of trauma and PTSD, eating disorders, and suicidal behaviors through culturally affirmative interventions with a special focus on Latinx emerging adults. Dr. Hurtado received her doctoral degree from the University of Toledo. And again, very much appreciate you jumping in, Dr. Hurtado, to take over when we're having a technology issue. Apologies, participants, for the confusions here. But we hope to have Marisol back up and running, and she can come back in. So I know that you were informed that there would be a second break, and there will be, but we're going to have some adjustments in our schedule here. So thank you, Gabby, and I will turn it over to you.
No problem. So hopefully my slides are now on your screen. So I will be presenting on the behavioral health interventions for both Latino immigrant children and their families. And I think both Marisol and Dr. Zayas gave a great overview of environmentally, what are some of the things for us to have into consideration as we are providing the services, providing assessments, and fulfilling some of our roles. I did want to use also a little bit of time just to give a little bit of context to some of the things that I'll be talking about. So we know that the population in the U.S., the immigrant population in the U.S. is pretty large. We're talking about 43.7 million immigrants, making about 13% of the population. And one of the things that we are seeing is kind of a shift in the socio-political context in our country within the past couple of years, where we're seeing an increase of nativist views, ethnocentric views, and that translated into policy affecting immigrant communities. There has been some recent studies looking at trauma exposure in immigrant families, and we're seeing that the rates of exposure to trauma previous arriving to the United States and during transit is pretty high. We have there's a recent study by Mercado, a professor at the Rio Grande Valley University of Texas, that looked at trauma exposure in Central American immigrant families. And what they found is that about 70% of families endorse having experienced trauma around crime-related situations, and approximately 50% had experienced physical or sexual trauma, the people that they interviewed. And they also saw that children and their parents both endorsed pretty high rates of post-traumatic stress symptoms compared to families and children that had not had any experience with immigration enforcement agencies. On the other side, though, we are seeing pretty significant disparities in both access and utilization of mental health services for immigrant individuals compared to those individuals who are not immigrants. And we've seen this consistently for several years, which, I mean, again, given the political context of the country right now, we're seeing even less usage of those systems. And Dr. Zayas talked a little bit about this idea of triple trauma. So the trauma that immigrants experience in their country of origin, during transit to the United States, and upon arrival. And that is kind of captured in a snapshot in some of the studies that I'll mention as I go to the presentation, but definitely in the presentation, in the study done by Dr. Mercado. And this is important that we consider this, because immigrant populations right now and historically are more vulnerable to having had experienced trauma. And so those symptoms will be present, and we need to be making sure that they have access to services that are culturally responsive, competent, and trauma-informed. So, you know, immigrant families experience significant stressors, and those stressors are going to impact their ability to seek mental health services. Some of the challenges and stressors Dr. Zayas and Marisol covered, but I wanted to highlight that there is a very high cost of services, and not a lot of people have access to mental health insurance and coverage. Also, a lot of people are not going to know how to navigate and find the services that might be more accessible where there are culturally responsive providers. There's also fear that if we engage in care, both physical and mental health care, that depending on our immigration status, we might be turned into authorities or be deported. There's also a limitation in the treatments that are available in different languages, with providers also being culturally competent and aware of the context that a lot of Latino immigrants and refugees are experiencing right now. And so I'll get a little bit into that in the rest of the presentation. There's also a lot of immigrant-related stressors. And so just having those in mind is going to be really important. In order to understand the context of families and children, I'm using the ecological framework model. So this model proposes that the individual experience is going to be shaped by the interactions, not only between themselves and their most immediate systems, like their family, their friends, church, school, but also those environments with the bigger community and societal context, as well as the interactions between those different systems. And so we usually focus on this individual level, age, education, history of the people that are coming to seek services. We assess their attitudes, their beliefs, their behaviors. But it is important that we look at the microsystem. So looking at the family, the closest circle, peers, partners, extended family members, anybody that has an influence in the behavior contributes to their experience, so that we're able then to use strategies that are going to be more family focused. They're going to allow us to talk about ways in which we can reduce conflict, improve communication, and just in general promote more healthy relationships. And then looking at the more mesosystems, so looking at settings like school, the workplace, the neighborhood, where the families are spending most time, and as well as a macro system, so the culture, the values in society at large at that time, but also media, politics, policies that are happening at that time. And looking at how those might transition and change over time, it's going to be really important to understand and contextualize the clinical picture that we're seeing with our clients, both at the individual and family levels. Some of these things allow us to understand what might exacerbate the symptoms of the stress that we're seeing, what makes it difficult for families and children to engage in treatment, or interfere with us being able to see them on the regular, or them using some of the skills that we are teaching during those interventions. Another model that I wanted to make sure that I spoke about was this model by Chavez Dueñas and her team on ethno-racial trauma, and understanding or providing an intersectional lens to the immigrant experience in the U.S. And how even within immigrant populations, we are going to see different areas impacting their experience as they adapt to the life in the United States. And so one of them is going to be, of course, their ethnicity or race, but also immigration status. So this fear of deportation is going to be, it's also going to put undocumented populations and individuals at a higher risk for exploitation and abuse, especially with the new changes that we're seeing to immigration policies and laws. It might impact their ability to carry on daily activities or wanting to leave their immediate environments. And we have to assess how that might impact children's ability to engage in school. How does it impact parents and their ability to be parents in that moment, and be supportive of their children as well. We're definitely going to see an impact in mental health based on experiences of racism associated with skin color or phenotype, as well as gender identity and sexuality, things that we need to have in the forefront as we're conceptualizing the experience of our clients. And this is, we're talking right now at the individual level. We need to expand this to also how this might impact families, and how there might be a bi-directional relationship in this relationship. So also what we're seeing is with this experience at the policy level, at the societal level, we're seeing a decreased sense of safety and security that I think Dr. Sayas spoke about, and how that, again, is going to have a functional impairment in our clients. It's going to impact, right, this, as I mentioned, their ability to seek services and report crimes, and this overall sense of being able to be themselves. When we're seeing ICE strategies to detain and deport individuals continue to escalate, and we're seeing an increase in immigrant detention by 32% or so since 2017, it's going to compound any experiences of trauma that we've seen in country of origin before, and then what we're seeing as people are adapting to life here. And so, again, important to have at the forefront as we are working with people, that these fears that we're seeing are not unwarranted. There's actually a lot of evidence for these different aspects impacting the experience of different individuals and their families. And also having in mind that people may have, it's very common for people to have different immigration statuses. So even if our clients per se are not being impacted because they're not undocumented, maybe families in their direct environment are, and so some of those concerns, of course, might impact them. And it's going to be important also to consider as we're talking about some of the more specific trauma-informed strategies. So moving on to specific considerations when we're delivering intervention to immigrant populations is going to be, and I think Marisol started talking a little bit about this, language accessibility and justice factor. So we want to make sure that we have staff and interventions that are effective for the clients that we're seeing, and part of doing that is to make sure that we are able to deliver services in the language, in the native language of our clients when possible. And we know that usually those interventions that are delivered in the preferred or native language of our clients are actually going to be more effective. And this is due to the fact that we process our emotions in our native language. And so, especially when we're talking about exposure and trauma processing and narrative, it's going to be important that we can do it in a way that we feel safe. So when that's not possible, when we're not able to have providers to speak that language, definitely having translation services available, materials translated into these languages is going to be key. And with that is not only having accessibility to certain languages, but also making sure that the materials and the treatment is delivered in a way that we are considering literacy, cultural views, context, references, and costumes, so that we are creating a very inclusive environment. So we are borrowing from the social justice lens to go beyond and above just creating accessibility, but actually creating interventions and environments that are culturally responsive. And this idea of cultural responsiveness is making sure that we're able to provide services to different cultural groups in a flexible way, where we can incorporate their values as well as practices that are relevant and consistent with those values and views of different groups. And what this is going to require on our part as providers is to be able to be honest with ourselves, notice where we are in regards to different biases and knowledge, and constantly monitor ourselves and train in different aspects and different strategies that can be consistent with different client populations. So again, this is going to be a process, not a place that we get to, but this is going to be a constant work on our part to question what are some of the things that we need to have in mind as therapists to be able to create an accessible environment and interventions that are going to be relevant to the experiences of our clients. And so there were some questions about specific evidence-based practices. So I'll get in describing some specific strategies, but first, we know that there's a lot of evidence-based treatments available. One of the things that we have to be mindful is that some of these treatments and the evidence around them in the studies were not done with immigrant populations or people from or people of color in general, and so we might have to, as we are running the interventions, be able to adapt those to be able to cover the needs of our clients. So that might mean sometimes we have to create the materials in different languages. Sometimes we might have to include extended family members, or include or expand our conceptualization of our client, or sometimes get a little bit creative as to how we may adapt that knowledge to different clients and contexts. So for example, there's been some studies that show that we can deliver cognitive behavioral therapy for PTSD on a group basis, and that has been particularly helpful for getting not only support for other people, but also being able to see how other people are using different skills, problem solve together, and create that community collaboration for specifically for Latino individuals. And then the other piece is going to be to make sure that we are creating community level interventions, that we are not only looking again at this individual level, but that we are looking at the context of our clients and building relationships with different community organizations that can target different needs that our clients may be having, especially with our immigrant communities. So it's not a bad idea to have connections with immigration lawyers, with domestic violence organizations, with shelters, with case managers, case workers, having people that can allow us to connect with different community resources that our immigrant communities might need, and be able to ask questions. And one of the reasons I specifically mention immigration lawyers is because the rules keep changing pretty quickly, and so we have to keep ourselves updated constantly to make sure that we are supporting our clients and assessing and asking the questions of services or things that they might not be aware of, and being able to connect them with those services, especially when we're having so many changes and there are these concerns around xenophobia, racism, and discrimination. We want to make sure that the people that we are connecting our clients is people that they feel safe with and can provide them those services in a way that is going to be helpful. And so usually a warm handoff is going to be, that it's going to be consistent with the trauma-informed lens. And so we want to make sure that we know folks, that we know what their work and organizations are about, and we're able to connect our clients in the most direct way possible. Okay, so then let's start a little bit with evidence-based assessments for clients that have undergone trauma. So this assessment I'm referring more so in clinical settings, not in immigration or forensic settings for some of our clients, although some of these considerations might be helpful. So the first thing in evidence-based assessment that we want to make sure we do is understand the child and the family's history, including trauma exposure, and that could be in their country of origin, during their transition to the United States, upon arrival to the United States, if they were ever in detention settings, what was that experience like for them? How was the release? What are some of the things that they still need to have in mind? Or for children to have experienced trauma in general, what is the context of the family, of their parents, of their relatives? And then understanding what are some of the reactions or concerns that parents may have. What are some of the contextual factors for the family? What is their ability, what is the relationship like? What is the ability of the parents to provide a healthy and safe environment and promote a healthy development is going to be really important. And as we are starting to our assessment process, to really understand any potential symptoms that the parents are seeing or that the child is able to verbalize if they're old enough, any changes in behavior, including any developmental delays or regression, is going to be really important. And usually we'll be able to get that not only from the children, but also from family members. And this might not mean just immediate family, but people that anybody that has a direct interaction with the kid for significant periods of time is going to be important that we have conversations with them so that we can get a clear clinical picture. And again, I'm referring here on clinical settings. For forensic evaluations, this might be a little bit different. We might not have access to all this informants at the time. So whoever we think might be clinically relevant, it's going to be helpful to have a conversation to get a clear picture of what might be happening with the child. And this is also going to be helpful as we engage in family therapy or parenting training, so that we're able to then create goals in treatment that might be not only helpful for the child, but for the system as well. So we can get some good information. And there's a lot of different tools available, some for free, some of them have a cost. And there are some databases that are out there from the National Network for Trauma and other organizations. So those are easily accessible through a search online. So if you're interested, you know, I'm always available to have a separate conversation offline about different measures that might be helpful for trauma, in case you're curious. So then moving to interventions, the one that we hear most often is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, or TFCBT. This is one of the gold standards of trauma-informed care for children and families. And the reason for this is because it has a lot of different modules that can be helpful in promoting safety, getting an understanding of traumatic events, and also helping at a system level create more positive relationships, safety for the family, and in general promote a safe attachment. So again, the first stage is always going to be assessment, trying to understand what the clinical picture of child or adolescent is. What are some of the symptoms that they're experiencing? And especially at the start, as Marisol mentioned, it's going to be really important to create this safe therapeutic relationship and creating collaboration with the parents and child or adolescent and getting them engaged in treatment. Then there's usually a stage of psychoeducation, so providing a lot of information around what trauma is and isn't, what are some of the common symptoms that we might see. This might be not only helpful for parents to be able to contextualize their child's behavior, but also for the child or adolescent to understand their own experience. There's also parenting modules where different strategies and skills are provided to the parents to be able to manage some of the externalizing behaviors that they might see as a result of trauma. As part of this, there are conjoined sessions where parents are going to join the child session to be able to practice some of the skills in vivo. There's also a lot of relaxation strategies provided in grounding to be able to provide this increased sense of safety in the moment, be able to regulate ourselves a little better, especially when we're feeling activated. And this is where some of the play therapies and art therapy strategies may come into place. As some of the questions before for Dr. Sayas, this might be helpful, but also, grounding strategies, breathing techniques, progressive muscle relaxation, getting some sleep hygiene, etc. in here. And then there's a module on affective modulation. So different strategies to be able for us to understand our experience of emotion and improve it. Similar to some of the other strategies that we mentioned, like DBT or somatic experiencing, where we'll be using different strategies to be able to contain and increase our window of tolerance, meaning our ability to be able to tolerate the stress, and this might be particularly helpful when we are not able to change the situation immediately. Then, of course, cognitive coping, and this is going to be really important, as well as trauma narrative modules, because this is where we're going to learn what are some of the trauma reminders that we have, what are some of the connections that we have between our thoughts, our emotions, and our behaviors, and what are some of the ways in which children and families have internalized their experiences of trauma and made meaning about themselves, especially around self-blame. And so we want to make sure that we're using these modules to be able to move away from internalizing some of the oppressive and systematic racism that families and children have experienced in their journey in adapting to life in the U.S., but also for those that have experienced detention or have had a lot of exposure to immigration enforcement agencies. We want to make sure that we're moving again from shame and self-blame to a more helpful and healthy understanding of their experiences, and that we're able to draw meaning and strength from there. Of course, there's going to be some exposure, especially this is going to be particularly relevant for folks that are experiencing PTSD symptoms and that have been able to identify some of those trauma reminders to be able to reduce the reactivity that we're seeing around that. And again, very important is going to be able to enhance the sense of safety and trust in the environment, but especially in the family system. And for this might, usually this is the way that I have it in the slide is the typical way in which DF-CBT is used. But of course, for those adolescents and children that have experienced not just one single event, but their experience is more consistent with complex or developmental trauma, we definitely want to move enhancing safety to the top, and spending a lot of time, as Marisol said, just building this rapport in this environment where people can trust us and can feel in general safe and hopeful about moving forward with treatment. If some of these other strategies might be helpful, especially when we're seeing, for example, more complex symptoms, or when we're seeing suicidal ideation and behaviors, DBT is going to be particularly helpful for those high-risk children, adolescent, adults. And so it's going to provide us with strategies for stabilization immediately, and conceptualize suicidal ideation, self-harm, and suicidal behaviors into our clinical treatment, and provide a lot of strategies, not only to modulate or address triggers, but also with this different urges and hopelessness that might happen after people have experienced detention, or they have experienced very significant trauma. And so we'll be able to provide some very structured context for people, provide some safety, provide them with strategies that they can have that feel tangible to manage some of those very difficult urges and agitation. And once people feel a little bit more stable in regards to those high-risk behaviors, then we can move into some of the trauma-focused CBT or some of the other interventions that have been determined as evidence-based. Another intervention that we know is particularly helpful with this population is somatic psychotherapy. And so that gives us a lot of strategies to reduce sympathetic nervous system activation and teach clients how to build this sense of safety when they're experiencing reactivity or agitation as a result of trauma. And we do that in very small steps. One thing to have into consideration with the previous two that I mentioned with DF-CBT and DBT and some of the other interventions is that people need to be at a place where they're somewhat stable. They can sit down, learn some skills, practice them. And a lot of the people that we're seeing pretty early on in the process might not be there. And so giving them pretty tangible tools to be able to reduce that reactivity and create that sense of safety within themselves and manage some of those very intense sensations can be particularly helpful. And somatic psychotherapy, as well as some of the strategies from EMDR, can be really helpful in that, in providing resourcing, providing grounding, providing different strategies that allow us to kick in the parasympathetic nervous system, changing our breathing, and reducing that fight or flight or freeze response, and recognize when those are coming up for us. And I included in this slide a lot of other interventions that have been evidence-based, that there's a lot of information out there. But again, some of this might be more effective for folks that may have one event in particular that they want to process, or they are at a more stable stage in their recovery from trauma. And for families, we're going to see that there's a few interventions. The ones that might be most relevant are behavioral family therapy, where we're focusing mostly on providing psychoeducation around PTSD, improving communication, giving them a lot of strategies as to how to listen to each other, slow down, ask questions, manage anger effectively within the family. What are some of the ways in which different members can provide support? And then problem-solving skills as a family is going to be really key. And usually, if it's not only the child or adolescent that have experienced trauma, but it's also different family members, it might be helpful for different family members to have individual support and then come in for sessions for family therapy. And then for family systems, there's going to be a little bit of additional focus on understanding trauma and providing the psychoeducation, but contextualizing trauma as a family issue where all members are going to provide support, and educating them about ways in which we can do this and communicate again effectively, but also understanding what are the roles within the family, and we're able to resolve conflict in a way that is effective and helpful, and not escalating people. Again, it's going to be important that if somebody is not yet at a more stable stage, they're still struggling a lot with fight or flight responses, they're still pretty agitated, that we do some individual work first and then we can bring the family system together. Or some of the times this might happen, especially with children as they're going through their own therapy, bringing in parents to add some of these different strategies, and as a parent is getting their own support, then eventually moving the family as a system. And this is going to be really helpful for families that have been in detention settings. One thing that we saw on some of the research we did with women that had undergone these conditions was that their role as parents was disrupted because they were not able to have a lot of control over their environment and their children's environment, plus some of them were separated at some point during the process. And so once people are released, we want to make sure that a lot of those issues are processed at the individual level, but also we are reestablishing what the roles are, the expectations and the rules for the family, and that we're able to provide support for their recovery. I went through that a little bit quickly, but I thank you for listening to me and the different strategies that we have available, and I'll be able to take any questions now.
Thank you so much, Gabby. I think that was phenomenal. I so appreciate the information you shared, very helpful, I think, for folks going forward. I want to just quickly circle back about our technical difficulties. It seems like for now, Marisol's connection is back and working, so we will be able to get in her presentation today, barring any continued problems with her connection, which we are keeping all of our appendages crossed that won't happen again. For now, let's, if you all have questions for Gabby, if you could please enter them into the group chat box right now. I will get those questions relayed to her. And if not, we will continue with a bit of a break and then circle back and come back with Marisol. So I'll give you 2 minutes to get your questions entered if you have any. We have one person, Gabby, that has given you some validation in what you have discussed, that those interventions have worked with them for unaccompanied children, and that they're very helpful. Follow-up question to that. Did you mention what interventions you use for toddlers separated from parents?
I did not mention that specifically. For example, TFCBT can be helpful, but usually that's for children between 3 and up. I think play therapy can be helpful, or some of the art therapy approaches can be helpful for toddlers or younger kiddos that have undergone trauma, just to get be able to resource them a little bit more. Some of the strategies that I mentioned usually require a lot of verbal capacity, and younger kids is going to be hard.
Fantastic. I don't see any other questions right now. So why don't we go ahead and take just a couple of minutes for a break, and I want to make sure that we can smoothly transition to Marisol's presentation. So unless there's any last minute questions folks want to get added quickly here, we will go ahead and take a break. Again, thank you, Gabby, for that thoughtful presentation and all of the insights that you provided around interventions for this population. If there are lingering questions that you all think of as we transition and through the rest of the event, again, we'll have all of our presenters come back at the very end. We can ask questions, and then going forward, please know that you can email us those questions and we'll get you that information. So let's take, I don't see any other questions, so let's take, can we take a 3-minute break so we can hop back in and stay as on timed as possible. Let's reconvene at let's say 1:12 to make that a full minute. And then we will start back with Marisol. Thank you so much, everyone, and for your flexibility and adaptability to these technology issues. Thank you all so much for your flexibility on this. I really appreciate your patience as we work through these hurdles. Amazingly, we still have 40 minutes, and so I think we, Marisol, it shouldn't be too much cut into this presentation that you're about to kick off for us again. If any of you have questions as we have dealt with a lot of transitions, please certainly send them to me again through chat box or through email. Just so you all know, I will be moving Marisol's slides through her presentation, and she'll be cueing me to change those slides. And Marisol, if there's any questions that come up for you as you're going through your presentation, feel free to jump in and ask those of me. And again, participants very much appreciate you. So Marisol, I will turn it over to you without further ado.
Okay, thank you for having me. Same as working with asylum seekers and refugees, we have to learn to be flexible. So thank you for pushing and staying with us. For this presentation, I will be a little bit more brief in the context of time. And so I'm going to start from the beginning, and I'm introducing best practices in serving Hispanic immigrant adults who are refugee and seek asylum. And next slide. And my objectives are actually to help you increase your knowledge in best practice foundations of providing mental health services to adults that are Hispanic refugees and asylum seekers, to apply the engagement concept of meeting the clients where they are in the context of the practical understanding of the client's migration phase, to help you guide the provision of mental health services. In other words, to help you by understanding your clients where they are in the migration phase, help you guide what is the decision that I need to make clinically in choosing which practice or which clinical actions I take. In addition, I will introduce briefly addendum best practices for screening, for assessment, and the treatment of adult asylum seekers and refugees. Next slide. And I think this is where I stayed earlier, that when my communication cut off. And so before taking any clinical action, we need to stop and think where our client is, where they stand, what their needs are. And Dr. Dean Sayas earlier had done a very good introduction to the impact of trauma, in particular in unaccompanied minors, and the impact that the current detention center policies and immigration policies are having on these children. Now, the immigration policies have also changed, and detention centers have increased for adults. And so in thinking and understanding where our clients are, it's important to understand that the impact of the trauma of adults who are actually more conscious, more aware, more knowledgeable, that a lot of them will have actually the words to express how is it that they're feeling or their discontent. And because of the multiple historical trauma that they experience, or the multiple history of complex trauma by the different types of traumatic events that may have happened in their lives during their migration, prior to their migration, before flight, that these things end in a deep sense of distrust towards authorities or governmental figures. And so we need to think, what is the role that we have that when we're facing and we're trying to help, that the nation is trying to help adults in the inhumane conditions, what impact that this has, and what is the impact that it has on them when we come in our role as mental health providers in a position, whether we like it or not, of power, expertise, and authority by the nature of our work, that we're expected to perform psychological evaluations and document the evidence of persecution, harm, or cruel treatment or torture, that role in itself has an authority. And therefore, we're going to face adults that, for the most part, in addition to the impact of their trauma, they will have a lot of experience of distrust. They have a lot of different thoughts about who we are, and not necessarily understanding where we come from. In addition to that, we need to rethink about that the concepts that we're going to use with them about mental health, about trauma, about treatment, about what is violence, about what is assessment, about our own concept of healing and recovery and treatment and best practices comes from our own cultural point of view and our own training, but that these adults may actually not have an understanding of our own processes, of this concept that we're going to be introducing them within our role. So we have to work a lot at making sure that we engage with them properly, that we establish a trusting relationship with them. And by doing so, next slide, we need to make sure that we focus first on make sure that we do no harm, because for a lot of them, we will be their first mental health professional, and that we're going to be their first listener and witness to their story, that we're probably maybe their first advocate or their first healer that they encounter within the United States. And so everything that we do, we have to make sure, because we're working with this vulnerable adults and vulnerable population that is in conditions in which they're in need of basic hygiene, safety, food, and their own mental health status, that we're mindful that our own biases, that our own procedures, whether they're evidence-based practices or not, we have to be mindful that we do not harm them, that we actually prevent re-traumatizing them with our work or add another trauma to their lives. So we need to make sure that we engage with them, we observe, that when we screen and assess, that we really keep the idea of doing no harm at every time very present, very aware of that. Next slide. By doing that and in creating this awareness and constant intention of doing no harm when working with asylum seekers, we need to remain humble and make sure that in our best practices, we incorporate cultural humility to guide the care and guide the engagement in our therapeutic relationship that we established with them, that we don't make assumptions about their culture or their language, that and that we're an open, inquisitive attitude of learning from them and sharing our power of our role, and give them the role of them being experts on themselves, and that we're there to learn from them, to listen to them, and in that way then build that trust. And this is very much even more important for those like me who your primary language may be Spanish, that in working with Latino refugees and asylum seekers, we can not assume that our words, our concepts, because we speak Spanish, mean the same to the person that we're working with. Because in Central America or in other places in the South American continent, many words in Spanish, similar words actually mean something totally different, that in some cultures could be appropriate, in other cultures could not be appropriate. And so it is important to do not assume that because you speak the language, you're totally competent in working with them, that you always check with them, what is the proper language, what is the proper way of defining their behavior, their culture, communication, their customs, the way that they conceptualize relationships. And so, and then for those who do not speak Spanish, in working with Hispanic asylum seekers or refugees, that you do use an interpreter, and that that the forms and the documents and the tools that you select are actually validated also in their primary language. Next slide. And so when working with them, we need to rethink and review and have a deep understanding. So what is our role? What is your role as mental health professional in working with this client? What is it being asked of you? Next slide. So are you an observer or an advocate? Which means that are you consulting about advocates for human rights? Are you there as a consultant observing because you're trying to influence maybe policy and practices related to immigration, or maybe even the treatment of adults or children who are seeking asylum? Or are you there to increase awareness and advocate for the mental health needs of this population? Or is your role more of the brief mental health supporter that conducts brief interventions or short-term treatment that helps increase coping skills or reduce the impact of trauma in immigrant detention centers? Or is your role the one of psychological evaluator or forensic psychological evaluator? And lawyers use different concepts. The role is the same. If you are in the role of doing the psychological evaluation, in which your psychological evaluation will become a writing affidavit that will be used in court to provide testimony to make sure that there's consistency of the behavior that you see, that there's evidence of ill treatment, persecution, harm, or torture as part of the legal request of the asylum seeker, and that you document through your evaluation the consistency of the legal terminology and the presenting issues that your client has. Now, an example of this brief mental health supporter versus psychological evaluator, when I was working at the Health and Human Services Commission of Texas in the role of children mental health director 2 years ago, there was a quick urgent call for actually in 2 days doing a 2,000 evaluation of this search of children that suddenly came in 2 days. And so we were looking for volunteers, and at that time there were a lot of people who were Spanish speakers, were willing to use translators that were trained, offering to do the psychological evaluations, while other folks actually that maybe they didn't have the training of doing the psychological evaluator role, they actually were there to actually provide brief interventions to help address with the coping and the immediate adaptation of this vast number of children that were suddenly moved from entering as a group to actually being in a detention facility. And then the last role that you may have would be as a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist that provides the treatment to actually address the impact of trauma of the asylum seekers, refugees, or unaccompanied minors in the resettlement sites. Next slide. And so a best practice in serving unaccompanied minors, asylum seekers, and refugees is to have a basic understanding of immigration law and definitions. So next slide. So it is important that each mental health professional that wants to work with this population, that wants to help, actually seeks proper training to understand what are these immigration legal procedures, what is the role of the mental health professional during the course of the immigration proceedings, what are these basic definitions or concepts that I may actually have to actually find that there's consistency between the presenting problems of my client and the definitions to help my client seek asylum. And so it is important to actually have training specialized in this area, and also to have at least a basic understanding of what are the difference between the United States law versus international law, because there are some concepts that we have in the U.S. that are different as how they are used international by the United States nation. Next slide. So for example, the definition of asylum. So asylum is actually, according to the American Immigration Council, and this is in alignment with the United States law, is the protection granted to a foreign national that is already living in the United States or is at the border or point of entry will meet the international law definition of a refugee. So when people are seeking asylum, they're seeking to actually request to have the definition of a refugee, that they apply, that they meet the definition of refugee, and that they're either at a border or already inside our nation and they're seeking asylum for the purpose that I'm going to explain in a moment. Now, the next slide. The Department of Homeland Security actually qualifies who seeks for asylum. And so as mental health professionals, when we're serving them, depending what it is asked of us, especially, again, if you're in the assessment and in the evaluator role, that you understand that the person who's seeking asylum, that this person must establish that they are a refugee who's unable and unwilling to return to his or her country or nationality, or last habitual residence if they have no nationality, because persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And so what this means is that they actually have to establish, and usually this is done by the lawyer that the person has, or their legal counsel or legal advocate, and then it may be by you if you're in the role of being the psychological evaluator or forensic evaluator, depending on how they define your role to be. And that you have to actually establish that that this person's race or religion or nationality or membership to a social group or their political opinion is at least a reason for persecution and the reason why they fear persecution. Now, you're just documented, you're not necessarily having to prove things, which is kind of like a very complex role for the evaluator. But understanding the definition is important. Next slide. Because when we look at who is the refugee is somebody who actually requested the same asylum for the basis of persecution or founded fear of persecution because of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular group or political opinion. But this is actually done before they cross the border outside the U.S. The determination and the legal status of refugee is done outside the nation. So when people are already in our nation or inside our border or in a point of entry like an airport or a shipyard, then they will not be necessarily granted at that point. I'm applying for a refugee is called I'm applying for a refugee status, and it's a whole different legal procedure. Next slide. Now, for unaccompanied minors who are also seeking asylum or may be seeking asylum, the definition is very different. For an unaccompanied minor, according to the United Nations, is a person who's under the age of 18, under the legal age of majority in the country where they're arriving. They are separated from both parents and are not with or being cared by a guardian or another adult who by law or custom is responsible for them. Now, this includes minors who are without any adult care or are entirely on their own, minors who are with siblings, or minors who are unsupported by an adult responsible for them, and or are with informal sort of foster families. And this definition of the United Nations, which is an international law definition. Now, on the next slide, what we're seeing is that the definition in the United States is different. And so when we're helping the children, we're navigating between two definitions of what an unaccompanied minor is according to the United Nations versus how we call in the United States an unaccompanied alien child under Homeland Security Act of 2002, which is a child who has no lawful immigration status in the U.S., who has not attained 18 years of age, and who has no parent or legal guardian in the U.S. available to provide care and physical custody. And so now, even though this is a definition of an unaccompanied alien child, the legal definition in the United States, we have a separate definition of what a child is. And if you see the definition above, it says child under the Immigration and National Act, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security, is an unmarried person under 21 years of age. And so even if somebody is in the transition age between 18 to 21, when they turn between 18 to 21, they're still considered a child, but if they're alone, they will not be considered an unaccompanied minor or an accompanied alien child. And so when we're working with them, it is important to understand how to navigate through these different concepts, because when you use them in your documentation, when you use the word child, when you use the word accompanied minor, which usually is not recommended, it's recommended that you describe the name of the person, that you describe and use their name and their description, not the legal concept, and in particular, unless your legal counsel recommends that, then you're sort of navigating this world and jungle of different concepts that will be used depending on in favor of your client or against it, depending on how you document when you provide services to them. Next slide. And so, in addition to this definition, I guess last but not least, when it comes to the individual, we need to think about family units. So a lot of these adults, Dean was talking, and Gabriela were talking about children and accompany minors. Now, for the adults, for the parents, and when are they considered family units? So the definition in the United States of the family unit is the children traveling with parents or legal guardians. So if they're traveling with their comadre, with their vecina, with their aunt, with their godfather, that will not be considered a family unit, even though culturally, according to the international law, they will be a family unit, because if by custom a person, their role is defined as family, international law grants them the role of family unit. In the United States, that is not the case. And this has led to changes in policies that has created separation of a lot of families. Now, this is in addition to the fact that parents or legal guardians who are actually with their children are also being separated. Some families who are separated, it is separated from family members or customary family members, while others, they're actually separated from parents or legal guardians. When the separation happens, those children are now considered unaccompanied minors and in the process of unaccompanied minors, because the fact is now they're not with their parents. And the issue that we all know is that there's not been a good way of tracking children, and our system has actually lost thousands of children because of these problems. Next slide. And the last definition that I will briefly mention that has to do, that is important for mental health professionals to understand, is the definition of torture and having training in torture. So about 35%, up to 35% of all asylum seekers and all refugees have experienced torture, according to national studies and international studies on populations that seek asylum entering our nation. And so this population exhibits, especially in adults, is also a different type of behavior. Some of them changes in personality, a lot of even more distrust in terms of authority, a lot of more high risk of stronger risk for presence of symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder or other severe mental illness too. Now, for an act to be considered actually torture, it must be an extreme form of cruel or inhuman treatment. It must cause severe physical or mental pain and suffering. And it must be specifically intended to cause severe pain and suffering. Next slide. So that is the definition of the Homeland Security. Now, people can request asylum in two ways: voluntarily or actively, by just expressing I want to seek asylum because of fear of persecution. Or people can also do it in a way when they enter, well, I want to request withholding my removal from this country, and I want to request asylum because I actually need the definition of torture, that I have experienced torture. And so for those cases, for those who actually seek asylum in this way, torture is an act inflicted for purposes as obtaining from the victim or a third person information or a confession punishing the victim for an act he or she or third person has committed or he is suspected of having committing, intimidating, or coercing the victim or a third person, or for any reason based on discrimination of any kind. Now, this inflicted act must actually be instigated or performed with the consent or by the hand of a public official or somebody acting on behalf of an official capacity. So even if somebody meets the definition of the act to be torturous, in order to actually meet this, it must have been performed or approved by somebody pretty much involved in official capacity. And the victim, the client that you have, must have been in custody or physical control of the torture at one point. And so if this torture does not include pain or suffering, or is incidental, then the rules will not apply and the person will not be eligible for requesting asylum according to this definition. Now, I am going through all these definitions is because your role as psychological evaluators will precisely document what is the impact of what is the trauma history that actually makes them eligible for seeking asylum, whether it's for torture or for fear of persecution. Next slide. So in understanding our client, I talked about in the beginning about our building that trust and the importance of the trust, and that we will be constantly facing somebody, an adult that will not trust us or that may not understand what it is that we're doing. We just need to learn to meet our clients where they are, which is a basic principle of engagement. Now, in the context of working with adults who are seeking asylum, next slide, we need to briefly understand beyond the things that Dean explained in the first presentation about the history of trauma of unaccompanied minors and the experiences that people have in this detention facilities or through migration, that mostly in adult Hispanic immigrant population, especially in Central American, we're working with a population that has a lot of history of trauma, of decades in a lot of countries of war or internal guerrilla conflicts, and that there's also still present, still at this day, the genocide of indigenous populations, Amerindian populations. It's pretty actually common in Guatemala, but it also happens in other countries, in Mexico and Central America. There are also populations that will actually experience systemic violence. So they may talk about their extreme poverty, of having lack of access to the basic needs of the infrastructure, or actually being denied because of discrimination of having access to water, to hygiene, to housing, or being forced and displaced, whether it's by government or by criminal organizations, to actually live in a safe place. A lot of this population, a lot of these adults will have experienced some type of persecution because political reasons. Some of them, as I mentioned, because they're members of an ethnic group. This is more common, as I mentioned, with the Amerindian and indigenous populations. And so the fear of persecution of being murdered is real because these countries actually experience a large number of community violence and a large prevalence and incidence of murders, not only across Central America, but actually in our nation. In Central America, in 7 of these countries, in particular Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, are in the top 10 nations in the world with the highest incidence of murders and community violence by organized criminal organizations. And this is when you hear about the different gangs or the Mara Salvatrucha, the MS-13, who are in El Salvador and Honduras that have taken actually power over a lot of communities in which the central government no longer has actually control. Now, when it comes to families and women, a lot of women seeking asylum or coming with their children as family units may actually come because their history of experiencing interpersonal violence, because of sexual abuse, physical abuse, rape, and a lot of cases of family and domestic violence. Some of them, men and women alike, will be seeking asylum because they were victims of human trafficking and exploitation. And there's 3 different types of this human trafficking and exploitation that happens the most in Central America. Or the sexual human trafficking, there's a labor exploitation for human trafficking, and there's also the organ exploitation. This is more commonly happening in men, in which men are actually kidnapped and they are forced to have surgeries against their wills, and their organs are removed, and that their organs are actually trafficked for the black market of human organs. And so there's people who are actually that seek asylum because of this reason in this particular population. And then we have, as I said earlier, that about 35% of them at least will have experienced torture or ill treatment. Next slide. So in understanding where these adults come and where they are, Dr. Desai has mentioned the migration phases earlier. Of the pre-flight or the pre-migration. He mentioned the migration phase, which I use the flight and separation for something I'm going to explain. But there's difference after that migration phase between the refugee migration phase and the asylum-seeking migration phase. So you need to understand, is my client a refugee? Meaning, was my client actually granted, this person, my patient, granted asylum before entering in the U.S., and maybe I'm seeing them at the point of resettlement, that maybe I'm seeing in a clinic that serves refugees. So the decisions that I'm going to make for this person are going to be very different than the clinical decisions that I'm going to make in when and how do I intervene with somebody that's an asylum seeker. The asylum seeker is still in a place in which there's no determination of their legal status, and there's not a clear necessarily a day when are they going to be deported or when are they even going to deport. And so you have to be very mindful before you even make decisions about which intervention I'm going to use, which treatment I'm going to use, which screening tool I'm going to use with this person, that I need to be mindful of where is my client at. And then use that to help me guide what is the selection that I'm going to make. So in asylum seekers, the migration phase for those in Central America is not just crossing the U.S. border, it's not just crossing the Mexican border. For a lot of them, is crossing El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Belize, Mexico, and then the U.S. So they have gone through a lot of multiple border crossing. Now, in that process, they may have not faced a place where they can actually request asylum as a refugee. And therefore, this moves the population to keep walking towards the U.S. to then request asylum. Now, for asylum seekers, you have three different types of asylum seekers. You have the ones who request asylum at the point of entry or upon arrival to the border or an airport, for example. So they arrive, and then at that point they say, I'm seeking asylum. So they did not enter undocumented or illegally at the point of entry. They actually request. So that is the type of asylum seeker that is not considered necessarily an undocumented, illegal immigrant. But they still have not been determined their immigration status. Then you have the population that is those that crosses the border undocumented, without a visa, without permission, and then they cross the border. Once they cross the border, if they did not request that asylum, now this person has been determined that then their status is undocumented, or U.S. law, they'll be considered illegal alien, which is the legal concept defined in this case. These individuals then are detained either minutes later, seconds later, months later, or years later. And then there's those who enter to the U.S. with a visa and proper documentation and legally, but their visa or legal or immigration status does not grant asylum or legal permanent residency. So some people then enter in that way, and then they stay or request asylum later, or let their documents expire, and then they request asylum. While for the refugee, the request asylum happens before. Some of them will have applied earlier. Some of them may have lived in a refugee camp waiting for sometimes months or years for the determination of their asylum. And then their asylum is granted outside for them individually or the family unit. Well, for the asylum seeker, we have this request of asylum legal immigration process that is very difficult to determine timelines that after the first 72 hours, if they have not been determined that it's an immigrant that has to be deported, then timelines change with changes in rules and regulations that you have to decide, okay, where am I seeing this person? Am I seeing them at the detention center? Am I seeing them because now they're pending a court of hearing? What do I need to do? Do I have time to serve them properly, or will I not have time and it's not proper to actually provide treatment at this moment? What are the living conditions that they have will vary in terms of resettlement for asylum seekers. That living conditions of refugees, adult refugees, actually grant a legal residence. They are helped and supported for 8 to 12 months upon arrival, with housing, with healthcare, with acculturation support, and for classes for learning English as a second language and support their acculturation and understanding the United States culture and how to function in it. While the person that is seeking asylum may actually be at a detention facility for a long time, that could be years, or maybe in a sponsor's house, depending on which court saw their case. The sponsorship is those who the court determines they can stay in the U.S. while we see their legal process, and maybe they're living with a family member or on their own. And then you have those that are living in the community, which are those who enter, who are not apprehended, that are trying to seek asylum from their own house after some period of time that they have entered. And then the resettlement for those asylum seekers will depend, are they deported or not, which type of visa are they granted, depending on the type of asylum that they're granted, there will be the resources that will be provided. So this is important for us to know when we're trying to make decisions. Next slide. And
Marisol, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but we're getting at 2 o'clock, and I want to allow there to be time so that participants who have the ability in their schedule to stay on to finish up to hear the rest of your slides. But for those of you who do not have the ability to do that and you need to jump into another meeting, I want to quickly flip to information that you all need on the evaluation. I want to make sure that you have the link available so that you can complete the evaluation and get your CEUs. So this is the, so Marisol, I'll jump back to finish up your presentation for those of participants who can stay on to finish the content. For those who need to jump off, I very much appreciate you being on with us today. I really can't tell you how much I appreciate, again, responding to some of the technical difficulties that we've had. Please note here the link to the evaluation piece, which both, again, ensures that we can continue to offer free events like this. I have seen some questions come through the group chat that excite me, that you all are interested in other trainings related to this topic, or future ones. And so in order to best reflect that, we need to have the evaluations completed so that SAMHSA sees that we are doing what we need to do by them. Please document the link here. There is a QR code here. I unfortunately was unable to test that out prior to the event just based on some of the settings that both ends have set up. But the idea is you should be able to, just with your phone, be able to snap that QR code and get it inputted into the back end, SAMHSA's end, through this link. So maybe that works, maybe it doesn't, but definitely if you note the hyperlink here, you will be able to access the evaluation that way. Please also, after you complete the evaluation, please send me an email letting me know if you need CEUs. That will be the only method of communication that we have to ensure that I can get you your CEU certificate. Again, as a reminder, I'll send out all of these details in a comprehensive follow-up email to everyone who registered for the event. If you are unable, if you weren't able to register for the event, but found out through a coworker, you can circle back and get some of that Eventbrite information, so you've got a way to contact us. We will again be posting the archived video of today's recording on another platform that allows us to continue to offer CEU certificates to those who view the video. So please share that with your coworkers and your colleagues. With that, I will flip now back to Marisol's presentation. Happy to go over these details about the evaluation again, but I want those who had to leave, they had the information that they needed to move forward. So more jumping around, but I appreciate your flexibility. Let me return to Marisol. Okay, Marisol, we should be back.
So we're ready to, after understanding these migration phases, we're ready to then to the process of selecting the best practices. Next slide. So we have to incorporate, next slide, in the process of selecting that we put together and be conscious about the do no harm, about understanding your role and what is being asked of you, that you can choose correctly what is that you need to do in the context of the migration phase of your client. And at that point, next slide, then you have to ask yourself, how will this practice benefit my client? How will this support my client's rights? Will it increase my client's safety, their local self-control, or their coping skills? Or will it decrease their suffering and promote their healing and recovery? Or will it do the opposite, will it do harm? What time will be allowed for me to provide the services? What is the location? What is the timeline of the immigration procedures? Do I have enough time to actually do a comprehensive psychological evaluation, or do I need to talk to the lawyer to give me time to actually do this evaluation? If I'm in a call to do a short-term intervention, what is the location? Is it safe? Is it proper to do group, or is it proper to do individual? Is it appropriate for me to actually do this specific intervention that I'm particularly choosing to do with these adults or with these children, in fact? And has this practice been validated and identified as the best practice for this population in this type of setting? And of course, always remember that you may be needing an interpreter, and that you have to actually, when you use an interpreter, that you have to prepare the interpreter for the procedure that you're going to do, for the type of translation and the type of information that they're going to be exposed to, and that you also help after you finish the service, debriefing that interpreter. And all these are actually part of best practices when working with asylum seekers and refugees. Next slide. And so when you address the mental health needs of these adults, there are 4 areas of best practice that you have to think about. One is about the care and case conceptualization and the frameworks that you're going to use to understand trauma and the adult immigrant. Same is true for how you're going to conceptualize care for children and unaccompanied minors. What are the best practices for screening, the assessment, and the treatment practices? Next slide. And so there are 2 foundational frameworks that I use and incorporate. There is the Global Mental Health Action Plan, which is a trauma framework to serve refugees and asylum seekers. Is by Dr. Molika. He's the director of the Harvard Program in Refugee Trauma at Harvard University. And there's also, if you're thinking about how do I conceptualize my case when I'm providing, when I'm doing the evaluation or when I'm actually providing treatment. For that, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network has the 12 core concepts of childhood trauma. Next slide. Now, before I go into just briefly mention this framework for Global Mental Health Action Plan for Recovery, is that it's important to remember that trauma-informed care is a foundational framework too, that it's a framework by SAMHSA, by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, tool that allows for a program or system to actually be sensitive and knowledgeable to the people impacted of trauma, their vulnerabilities, of those impacted by trauma, and the workforce that works with them. And thus, there are certain principles that we use of trust, of building trust, of collaboration, of mutuality or transparency, of promoting peer support, and the use of other best practices to actually guide care. And so Dr. Lika created this model is actually using at the international level the most. It's used more in the international level, but in the U.S. As the actual best practice to guide recovery for individuals and for countries and governments. Depending on how you apply this model, you can use it at the individual level or at the system level. So when doing that, you're trying to make sure that you understand the policies, that you avoid re-traumatization, and you promote their recovery by the use of ethics, proper evaluation strategies, and evidence-based research practices. That you actually link your adult client to some opportunity of economic development that can lead to employment, that your role incorporates not only the people that you're working with and maybe be a legal advocate in the U.S., but because your client has a chance also for deportation, that you know which are those other resources that may be able to support this person if they are deported, who actually can provide mental health services outside. How can we ensure that they actually have legal advocacy if they're actually deported where they are sent? Now, the foundation of evidence-based practice is at the core in the middle of this model to help actually guide the individual treatment and recovery of the individual. And we also incorporate interventions that may be short or psychoeducations and other things for all the multidisciplinary or even altruistic and cultural traditions to promote recovery. And that everything that you do is to help support and enhance and advocate and empower our clients for their own human rights. And that the work that we do will ensure that we are respecting their human rights and that we're reestablishing justice for them through our work. And also financial systems that will support their recovery while they resettle at the end. Next slide. The other model that I'm just going to briefly mention is the 12 core concepts of childhood trauma to help us conceptualize the case of what we're working on. And the National Traumatic Stress Network, even though they developed this in the context of working with children, these principles and these core concepts are also applicable for any adult across their lifespan, in which the impact of their trauma, as you work with them, whether you're assessing their symptoms or you're providing treatment or intervention, that you understand that trauma is complex, that you will find a person that will be impacted, their context in which trauma happens and their life experience and their personal experience and strength will actually be a factor in how they will interpret or how they will be impacted by the adversities or traumatic events that they were exposed to. That the individual will actually experience adversities and that they will experience other sequelae of events that can also be traumatic in itself as they actually seek asylum. And that our role as mental health professionals, or that the spaces that we work with them, or that the colors that we wear, or that the way that we look can be reminders for them of prior trauma experience or loss that they may have experienced, and that we will see a wide range of reactions, and that those reactions are the ones that we're screening and assessing. And that the experience of people seeking asylum is an experience that is led primarily by danger, by fear, by primary core loss of sense of safety over real actually loss of safety. And thus when we're healing, we have to actually make sure that we help our clients rethink and come back to a new definition and a healthier way of reestablishing how do we create safety in this new place? How do I create safety for myself, even when I'm in a place that is still dangerous? that the trauma will impact not only the individual, even if you're just working with an adult, that it will impact their family or their caregiver system, maybe back in their country. And that our clients and those adults have very strong promotive and protective and promoting factors, that even though they may be actually suffering or hurting, there's things that they have strengths that we can build upon to make them heal and move to a resilience. And the impact of trauma has actually impacted their development as a whole across the lifespan if they actually have experimented a lot of multiple traumas. And that the neurobiology of the impact of trauma can cause, changes in their of thinking, changes in their body, that they may actually have experienced physical trauma that also causes neurobiological changes in the way that they think, in the way that their brain functions. And so we also have to conceptualize that if you're the one doing psychological evaluation and there's actually physical ill treatment against that person, whether it's physical abuse or torture, that you make sure that you talk to the lawyer and ensure that there's also a medical evaluation for that person, so that you're not crossing and describing something that is outside of your scope of work, that a physician who has been trained in doing the evaluation of the physiological and neurobiological impact of the trauma is documented separate from your psychological evaluation. And that you consider, as I mentioned earlier, the culture, our social structure, contracts, and our legal and ethical issues. And that all of that is also going to impact us and create risk for provider distress and risk for secondary traumatic stress and compassion fatigue. Next slide. So after we frame and understand, okay, where are we coming from? Now we have a framework. Finally, Marisol, we're finally getting to this best practices. What are they, right? And so first thing is, screening. So how do we screen? What are the best practices for screening? When do we screen? So screening is usually used either you're called to provide treatment, or you screen for the purpose that is required as part of your psychological evaluation. Screening in the process of migration for trauma is not necessarily just openly done, universal, like in other settings that are trauma-informed. It is not recommended that you don't do any type of unnecessary screening with clients. So you have to actually be able to pick and use these tools properly when you have to. Now, the 4 tools that I put here are 4 tools that have been used, translated, and validated with Hispanic populations that are asylum seekers and refugees. That these are actually proven tools that work for this population, that have been translated in Spanish. Some of them have been translated in multiple language. The first one is a Refugee Health Screener, 15, the RHS 15, and this was actually developed by Pathway to Wellness Project. It's translated and validated into 7 languages, including Spanish. And it was actually developed in a community public setting to serve across refugee groups and asylum seekers. And it is used to screen anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder in adults, refugee, and asylum-seeking populations. The next one is the Hopkins Symptoms Checklist 25, which is usually used a lot in combination with the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire. Some people use it as a kit, other people use it separately. The Hopkins Symptoms Checklist 25 is a self-administered questionnaire originally developed to measure the change in anxiety and depression symptoms in the context of psychotherapy, but it was later validated to actually use in refugee populations. The next one, even though most recently, and this is kind of like a new one in the pack of tools, recently there has been a few studies that have been working on validating the Patient Health Questionnaire, the PHQ-9, to actually be used with refugees and asylum-seeking populations, in particular in primary care settings or integrated settings. This is where it's used the most. It is not used as much traditionally by mental health professionals in mental health clinical settings, but there's a rise in literature on the use and the evidence of this being effective for asylum seekers and refugees that speak Spanish and are from the American continent. And then the last one has been used for many years, which is the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire developed by Dr. Malika and his colleagues. It's a 4-part questionnaire that screens for trauma, screens for depression and anxiety, but also does a screening of the history of ill treatment and trauma, and it goes in a very long, comprehensive list of different types of ill treatments and cruel, inhumane treatment towards adults that seek asylum. And this is used the most. It is actually supported and promoted as a best practice by the United Nations Human Rights Council. And now, the thing that I have to say is that there's actually no screening tools that, or assessment tools that were developed and validated solely to screen and assess Hispanic adult refugees or seeking asylum that are adults. There are a few that have been in development for children, but not for adults. So although these tools can be used, they were not originally actually developed for the population of Hispanic adult refugees and asylum seekers. Next slide. Now, on the assessment beyond the assessment, when we move to the psychological evaluation that I did mention it throughout my presentation several times, there are 2 best practices protocols. We have the Istanbul protocol, and we have the Examining Asylum Seekers protocol. The Istanbul protocol is like the gold standard that most people use, that a lot of people train on, that was developed by Dr. Vincent Icopino from the Physicians for Human Rights in their late 80s, and it was later in 1999 accepted and incorporated by the United Nations. And this is a manual that on effective investigation and documentation of torture and cruel treatment. I'm listening to sounds, and I'm not sure if my communications have been interrupted again.
Yeah, I'm not sure, Marisol. We're trying to look at that on our end as well.
Okay, then I'll continue. For a moment, I thought, oh my God, I got disconnected again. Okay, and we're almost there, people. Thank you for hanging out with me to this presentation. So the Istanbul Protocol is a manual, and there's a lot of organizations that provide training on it. I will mention them right at the end, but where can you actually get training on the Istanbul Protocol? And the other one is actually a health professional's guide to medical and psychological evaluations of torture. It can be downloaded. Well, you have to buy it, but it can be downloaded at the Physicians for Human Rights website. It was created in 2018. And those are the primary top best practices used for psychological evaluation. Although there are other models that comes from forensic evaluation of post-traumatic stress disorder that is complex in the United States. Those other models were originally developed for populations with post-traumatic stress disorder that was severe, but they were not necessarily refugees. They were mostly veterans and military population. And later they were adapted and moved towards using them for populations that are refugees, asylum seekers. Different of that, and that's why I'm not including those. I'm including the ones that have been developed and proven effective models that immigration courts use and look for if you are a credentialed, trained mental health professional, that you will use one of these. Next slide. Last but not least, I'm moving to short-term interventions and treatment of adults, asylum seekers, and refugees. The short-term intervention, I mentioned them way at the beginning. Depending on your role, you may do psychological interventions. in some detention centers. The one that is widely used is psychological first aid for the immediate response of arrival to a detention center. Sometimes it's also used after the immediate aftermath of traumatic critical incident, or if there's a group of refugees that is being moved from another country to this country upon arrival, or before they leave the other country. Some people actually use psychological first aid with refugees, asylum seekers. This is a short intervention that focuses on providing coping skills, increased supports and the resources so that the person can have the basic needs met, such as a legal needs, a legal advocate, or mental and physical health needs, and being recover quickly, a sense of safety in their new environment. The other practices that people use are actually more like best practices nuggets. So at the core of all best practices and evidence-based practices for the treatment of trauma and the treatment of people that are asylum seekers and refugees is to build back a sense of safety. As I mentioned in the 12 core concepts of childhood trauma, danger and the recovery of safety have to be prioritized consistently and be at the top priority. It doesn't matter which stage the person is under migration, whether they're in a detention facility, no matter how horrid that situation is. That's what we have to advocate for our clients, for their safety. And we have to help them build an awareness of what is safe in that new environment and who is safe. We also have to move them in the process of the evaluation to understand, has their sense of safety been distorted, or how can I help you regain that you continue rethinking about your safety as you move, maybe to working with somebody else later through your immigration proceedings, to keep building that sense of safety. Healing and recovery will not occur if we have not worked in helping a person or a child regain a sense of safety. The other practice that is recommended for short-term intervention is emotion regulation skills and grounding, these are skills to calm, breathe, regulate, and coping mechanisms to function in the present time. So our focus in this, when we're working with clients for a very, very short period of time, when we don't have time to go into in-depth process of healing, which actually will be detrimental for them if you open up somebody and start treatment, and then they're still in a detention facility, or they're still in danger, where they're still traumatized, is not the place for you to incorporate evidence-based practices of treatment. Things that you can work with them at that point will be, how can I help you give some, let's work with breathing, let's work with grounding, let's try to actually focus on being on this seat and feeling safe. Those very basic breathing and grounding techniques and mindfulness are the things that actually found very effective in the population, regardless of their migration phase. But mostly it is actually what you can use when they're still not in a resettlement phase and you don't know how much time we'll have to work with them. The last thing, which is actually a mental health best practice, actually all both protocols recommend, is that you have to ensure that your client is referred to a legal advocate, that you ensure that your client has a legal advocate or a legal counsel that represents them, because justice is part of the healing and the recovering the foundation of individuals seeking asylum. And it's pretty much, this is very crucial when you're working with adults that actually have experienced torture. So regaining a sense of justice and feeling that justice has been served will serve as part of the healing of your client. So we're moving with, okay, what are the trauma evidence-based treatment with this population? So I created here a list of evidence-based practices for treatment of trauma that have been evidence valid and used with asylum seekers and refugees that are Hispanic immigrants. So those are the eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, which was developed by Dr. Francine Shapiro And it was designed to alleviate the distress associated with traumatic memories, and has been found to be very effective with refugee populations and immigrant populations, since it may not require a lot of going in depth into trauma or things that are that will trigger your client into an alternate hyper aroused state, which a lot of people with complex trauma may experience. Then EMDR is actually have found being very effective with this population. The next evidence-based practice is narrative exposure therapy. This is mostly used a lot in Europe. It's also used in the United States. It has a lot of evidence. It was created by Dr. Maggie Shore, Dr. Thomas Elbert, and Frank Neuner at the University of Constance in Germany. And this is psychotherapy that, with the guidance of the therapist, a patient establishes first a chronological narrative of his or her life, and then concentrates on telling the story of traumatic experiences, but also incorporates positive elements. Sometimes this can be done in a narrative way. Some people use objects or drawings to tell their story. Now, in the Hispanic culture, storytelling, personal story, familiarity, and having a very strong cultural foundation in storytelling that passes for centuries is something that is core in most of the Hispanic Latino culture. And so narrative exposure therapy has been found effective. Yes.
I'm so sorry to cut you short. I'm worried that with time we're approaching 2:30 and not wanting to have any disruption.
Can I finish? Because my next slide is resources. So the next, I'll just be brief that we have targeted trauma affect regulation data education and therapy by the University of Connecticut, Dr. Julian Ford, and then we have trauma and recovery and empowerment. It actually works with women with trauma and substance use. The next slide are actually, if you pass them, what I have is actually for people when they get the slides that you have the list of resources and where you can find more information on how to serve this population and how to find some of those protocols. And then my contact information in the last slide. If you ever have any questions, that's all I have. And it is 2:30 and I hit the clock by the mark.
Thank you all so much. And thank you, Marisol. And I'm sorry to make you rush through the last bit.
Well, and I apologize to all for the technical difficulties that changed the order of our webcast today.
That's okay. I do want to ask, there are a number of folks asking if your slides could be available. So I just want to confirm that would be fine to share those slides.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Wonderful.
The PDF. Thank you.
Wonderful. And we'll get the confirmation from our other presenters as well. I had wanted there to be a bit of time to answer some last minute questions, but I think in the interest of time, I would ask that you send those to us. I will put my email address in the chat box. And in the meantime, please, again, note this link to the evaluation. I should have noted earlier, the evaluation forms that SAMHSA currently uses has the term substance abuse instead of mental health. They are shifting over right now, but as does a lot of things, the slow move of bureaucracy, sort of like molasses, I mean, whatever that saying is applied here. So please just know that when you look at the evaluation form where you see substance use, think mental health. In the context of this evaluation, SAMHSA promises those forms are going to be changed for us in October, but that doesn't do you all any good, so I apologize. Again, all of this information will be sent in a final email. I'll have my contact information there as well as the other presenters. And With that, I would thank again all of you for engaging and working with us around these technical issues. And again, we are looking at developing this into a series, so please stay tuned for additional information on that. I'm so encouraged by all of the questions that were asked in the chat box. I think there's some really great energy, and hope that you've gotten some really good strategies to take back to your work with the families that you work with. Take care, and I will look forward to being in touch with all of you very soon.